The story I'm going to tell you about is just one of thousands of examples of when the law was weaponized against a black person just because they were black. It didn't matter that all the evidence pointed towards his innocence. Being black was his only crime. This is a really crazy story, and that's the only word that comes to mind when I think about what happened to this black man. But when you consider just how black people were treated during the Jim Crow era, it's not that surprising. Any and everything was on the table when it came to inflicting injustice on black people. This story is just one of them. One of the hallmarks of injustice against black people is that the truth does not matter. When it came to lynching, the truth never mattered. If an allegation was made against a black person, you could be lynched. It didn't matter if that allegation turned out to be false. Pig Lockett and Holly White were lynched in 1930 after a newlywed white couple lied and said that two black men attacked them and threatened to violate the wife. The mob lynched two innocent black men who had just left a church revival. And after finding out that the couple lied, everyone acted like nothing happened. The truth did not matter when Maurice Mays was executed in 1922 for allegedly taking the life of a white woman. Years later, two other white people were implicated in that same crime. And sadly, the truth did not matter for many countless other black people who have lost their lives or had them destroyed by Jim Crow forces. Black people's credibility and alibis and evidence and the truth were all disregarded on account of their race. Being black convicted you and executed you. And that's exactly what happened to Ben Bess in South Carolina in 1914. The truth was disregarded for a lie just because he was black. Ben Bess was born in February of 1876 in Georgia. Sometime later, Ben made his way to South Carolina. Ben was able to work hard and obtain land in the city of Florence. Ben owned so much land that he rented it out to other farmers, including white farmers. Later, Ben married a woman named Sally Moses. Sally was from South Carolina. Ben and Sally lived comfortably in Florence. Ben was known as a respectable landowner and farmer. Even though Jim Crow ruled the day, Ben and Sally managed to thrive. In 1914, Ben rented some of his land to the Collins family. This would turn out to be the worst decision that he ever made and would end up costing Ben everything. Frank Collins was born in 1843 in South Carolina. That means he had a vivid memory of slavery and black people being in bondage. We found records that suggest that Frank might have served in the Civil War and fought to preserve slavery. In 1906, Frank married Maud Hyman. Maud was Frank's second wife. His first wife, Jane, died in 1900 at the age of 42. That would explain the 32-year age gap between Maud and Frank. Frank was not well off financially. After the Civil War, he worked in the sawmills and later as a farmer. By the time 1914 came around, Frank was 71 years old and rented land from 38-year-old Ben Bess. This was not an ideal situation for a white man to be in during the Jim Crow era. Frank was in a predicament that was designed for a black person. The system was not set up for a white man to be below a black man. It was designed to be the other way around. And this ended up causing problems for Ben Bess. The Collinses became deeply indebted to Ben, and in 1914, Ben told them that he was not going to rent to them any longer, and they needed to leave his land. This angered the Collins family, so they came up with a plan to ensure that they did not have to pay Ben nor leave Ben's land. They used a tried and true allegation that would ruin Ben and ensure that they would never have to deal with him anymore. They said that Ben attacked Maud. Maud said that one day she was at home and she decided to do some sewing, so she went and got her sewing machine. She said that she was in the hall sitting at the machine when all of a sudden she looked up and saw Ben Bess standing in front of her, and she was not expecting him. Maud said that Ben then grabbed her by the throat and told her that if she said anything, he would take her life. She said Ben grabbed her with such force and then dragged her across the hall by the throat to the bedroom and attacked her. After he was done, she said Ben left. Ben was later arrested and he was charged. He denied that he had done anything to Maud Collins, but it did not matter what Ben said. It didn't matter if he had an alibi. All that mattered was that he was black and Maud was white, and Ben was accused of Jim Crow's #1 crime. Ben was tried twice for this alleged crime. The first time he went to trial, the jury was not able to reach a verdict and a mistrial was declared. Now, this is an important part that we should not gloss over. Ben was charged with violating a white woman in the Jim Crow South decades before the civil rights movement to end racial injustice began. This was the kind of allegation that would get a black person lynched, and no one would think twice about it. And this was also a time when black people were kept off of juries. During this time, the juries in South Carolina were overwhelmingly white. So the fact that an all-white jury could not agree on a verdict in a case where a black man was accused of violating a white woman means that they may not have believed what Maude told them. But the issues at the first trial that led to a hung jury were corrected at Ben's second trial. Ben was tried again in June of 1915. Maude testified, and so did Frank this time. On June 7, 1915, Ben was convicted of attacking Maude and sentenced to 30 years in prison at hard labor. He was sent to work on a prison farm where he was forced to work as a convict laborer for up to 14 hours a day in the grueling hot sun doing back-breaking work. Ben was absolutely devastated by this conviction. He had not done anything wrong except to demand that he be paid what Frank and Maude Collins owed him. Everything that Ben had worked for was now gone. His good name, his wife Sally, his wealth, they were all taken away from him, and it was all based on a lie. This was too much for Ben, and on June 12, 1915, just 1 week after being convicted, Ben tried to take his own life. Ben made a rope out of his blankets and used them to try to hang himself. The blanket rope was not strong enough and it broke, and when asked why he did it, Ben said that he'd rather die than to go to the penitentiary for 30 years for something that he did not do. At this point, there was no help coming from Ben. Ben was 38 years old and doing convict labor. He never thought he'd end up here. He was supposed to be there until he turned 68 years old, but the life expectancy for a black person Ben's age in 1914 meant that he likely would not make it to 68. Ben's 30-year prison sentence was a death sentence for him. He was not supposed to leave prison alive, but there was one person who did not give up the fight for Ben, and that was his wife Sally. After Ben went to prison, Sally had to continue on without him, but she did not forget about Ben and the injustice he suffered because of a lie. To support herself, Sally went to work at the YMCA. The wealth that she and Ben had was gone, and she needed money to care for herself. Sally knew that Ben was innocent of the crime he was convicted of, and she continued to champion his cause. Frank Collins died in February of 1918 at the age of 76, leaving Maude with nothing. This meant that Maude was desperate for money. In the first few years after Ben had been in prison, Sally tried to get Maude to come forward and tell the truth. Maude said that she would tell the truth, but it would cost Ben. She told Sally that she would accept $700 to come forward and say that Ben was innocent. Now, remember, Ben and Sally had lost everything. They had nothing. They had lost their wealth and their land. This was an amount that Ben and Sally could not pay. That's about $15,000 in today's money. And Sally told Maude this, but Maude didn't care. Maude had a price. She told Sally that if they could not come up with that money, she would be keeping her mouth shut and Ben would stay in prison. Before I move on, take a look at this. This is Ben's draft registration card from 1918. Even though he was in prison serving time for something that he did not do, his country still required from him to register for the draft just in case he needed to be sent off to war. Now, notice how in the space for occupation, it says convict at the state penitentiary. Also at the bottom, that's Ben's signature. This record is really one of the only things we have that proves that Ben Bess ever existed, and it documents the pain and trauma and injustice that he suffered. A few more years went by. It was 1927, and by this time, it had been 13 years since Ben was arrested, and 12 years since he had been sent to prison. He was still doing grueling convict labor. He worked every day logging trees. Ben's days consisted of cutting down trees and rolling them, and then transporting them using hand tools and carts. It was absolutely awful. He did this every day for free. This is the 1920 census. It shows Ben Bess listed as a convict. This was written when Ben was languishing away for something that he did not do, all because of a lie told by Maude Collins. But once again, Sally did not give up fighting for her husband. Sally spoke to a white man in Florence named John Timmons and asked him if he would help her to get Ben released from prison. He was a retired merchant and farmer. Timmons knew Ben and Sally. He had traded with Ben back when Ben was a wealthy landowner and farmer, and Timmons did not believe that he had been guilty of any crime. He remembered how many people doubted Maude's claims when Ben was tried the first time. Timmons said he'd help Sally, but that Maude Collins would have to come forward and tell the truth. Sally wanted to talk to one of Maude's sons, Irvin Parker, and asked him if his mother would come forward and tell the truth about what happened. She said it had been years since Ben was sent to prison and it was time for him to come home. Parker spoke to his mother Maud, who was around 50 years old at the time and wasn't in the best of health. She thought her days were numbered. Maud said that she was ready to come clean about what happened and told Parker to go and talk to Timmons. In the spring of 1927, Maud's son Parker went to meet with Timmons. He said that his mother would come forward and tell the truth. She was willing to say that Ben was innocent of the crime. Her reason was that she was getting old and didn't have much time to live and wanted to make things right. But Maud had a request. In order for her to tell the truth and support Ben being released, she wanted $75 to do it. That's how much the truth and 13 years of Ben's life in prison was worth to Maud Collins. Timmons told Sally, and Sally quickly wrote to Ben, who was at the prison farm. She told him what it would cost for Maud to tell the truth. Ben wrote back and said that he believed that he can come up with $50. Somehow, Ben was able to do it. He was able to raise $50 to give to Maud. Sally reported to Timmons that they had $50 and to see if Maud would accept that instead of $75. Timmons had another meeting with Maud's son Parker and told him that Ben and Sally had come up with a little bit of money, but it wasn't what they had asked for. After speaking with his mother, Parker came back to Timmons and said that Maud would accept it and to tell Ben and Sally to send her the money. She needed it before she did anything. Once Maud received her $50 payment, she sent word that she was ready. Timmons was going to petition the governor of South Carolina, John Richards, to release Ben. He enlisted the help of other white men in the area to prepare the petition. First, he went to attorney David Gordon Baker and asked him to draft an affidavit for Maud to sign. The affidavit would state the truth, which is that Maud made the story up, lied at Ben's trial, and she was coming forward to tell the truth to have Ben released from prison. Once the affidavit was drafted, Timmons arranged to meet with Maud. On April 10, 1928, Maud Collins, her son Parker, and Timmons went to probate judge J. Rob Lawrence to sign the affidavit in his presence. This would have been done to ensure that no one could claim that Maud was forced to sign it or that she had never signed it at all. Timmons was banking on the fact that both he and Judge Lawrence were respectable white men, and that carried some weight. He would come to learn that he was wrong. Once in the judge's chambers, the affidavit was read aloud for everyone to hear. It said, "In the case of State versus Ben Bess, realizing that I have not much longer to live, hereby desire, as nearly as possible, to undo the great wrong I have done to this Negro, the said Ben Bess, and hereby declare that my testimony upon the trial of the case was untrue, and that Ben Bess should not be serving any sentence. I further declare that I am making this statement freely and voluntarily." After it was read, Maud signed it. There was nothing confusing about this statement. It cannot be mistaken for anything other than what it was. She was admitting that she lied and wanted Ben released. Not one time in the judge's chambers did Maud Collins say that this was not true, or she was confused, or anything like that. She signed it, and that was supposed to be it. After Maud signed the affidavit, everyone was hopeful that Ben would be released. The one thing that had prevented his release was now accomplished, and that was getting Maud to admit that she had lied. Attorney Gordon sent the affidavit along with a pardon petition to Governor Richards' office requesting Ben's release. The affidavit was also sent to Florence County Prosecutor L.M. Gasque. After reviewing the affidavit and seeing that Maud was now admitting that she had lied, Prosecutor Gasque wrote a letter to Governor Richards recommending that Ben be released from prison immediately. The pardon petition reached the governor's office in early May of 1928. He read Maud's affidavit and the letter from Prosecutor Gasque and moved quickly to correct this injustice that had been done to Ben Bess. On May 4, 1928, Governor Richards suspended Ben's 30-year sentence and commuted it to time served for good behavior. Ben was finally released from prison. He spent 13 years in prison working hard labor for a crime that he did not commit. And then, 1 week later, the governor made official what had always been true. On May 12th, Governor Richards granted Ben a full and unconditional pardon. This wiped out Ben's conviction and declared him innocent of the crime and wrongful conviction that had stolen everything from him. He thought he could finally start his life over. After Ben was released, he wrote a letter to the governor thanking him for the pardon and for liberating him from prison. Can you imagine what that must have felt like for Ben? He was now 50 years old, but this was a hard 50. He had spent over 4,700 days in slavery working in horrific conditions. Everything he had worked for had been stolen from him. He had missed holidays and birthdays and anniversaries, and he had missed loved ones who had died and did not get a chance to properly grieve for them. He had been away from his wife for over a decade, and even though she continued to fight for him every day and she still loved him, The Ben she knew in 1914 when he was arrested was gone. He was not the same person. You're not the same after going through what Ben experienced in prison for over a decade for something that he did not do and experiencing convict labor. Governor Richards asked Attorney General John Daniel to look into whether Ben could be compensated by the state for the 13 years he spent in prison. The AG came back and said that there was no law that South Carolina had that authorized public funds to be paid to Ben for his wrongful incarceration. Because there was no way for the state to compensate Ben, the governor decided to ask the public for help until the legislature came back in session and passed a bill to pay Ben. The governor asked the newspaper The State to put out a call for donations and create a fund. It was called the Bess Fund. The paper asked his readers to send money in for Ben. $600 was the amount that the paper wanted to raise. That's about $11,000 in today's value. The paper informed its readers on how much money was being raised and who sent money in for Ben. The plan was for Ben to receive monthly payments of $60. Ben's case touched a lot of people. There was great sympathy for him all across South Carolina after he was pardoned. People were upset that he had been prosecuted for something that he did not do and that he spent 13 years in prison for it. And I'm not talking about black people. White people expressed outrage for what happened to Ben. Thomas Sanders was a prison guard who supervised Ben. He said that Ben was a good, hard-working person. Sanders got to know Ben and said that he believed that Ben was innocent. He said Ben should be given money and all of his land back, and if the state did not help Ben, then he would do all that he could to help Ben get back on his feet. One of the jurors who was on Ben's first trial that ended in a mistrial, he spoke out as well. J. Furman Hill said that the only reason Ben was convicted was because he was black, and that wasn't right. There were also those who were concerned about what would have happened if the jury in Ben's case had not recommended mercy for him. What if Ben had been executed and hanged? And that could have happened. In 1902, a black man named Julius Gibbs was convicted and hanged in Florence for the same thing that Ben was convicted of, attacking a white farmer's wife. In 1906 in Greenville, another black man named Andrew Townsend, he was convicted and hanged after being accused of attacking a white farmer's wife. Ben's name could have been added to the long list of black men who had suffered a similar fate. And all of this fueled anger towards Maud Collins for what she did to Ben Bess. Governor Richards asked Prosecutor Gasque to investigate whether Maud Collins should be prosecuted for committing perjury at Ben's trial when she testified and falsely accused him. Gasque said that he would convene a grand jury to look into the matter and bring charges against Maud Collins. When Maud found out that she could go to jail, she changed her story quickly. Maud came forward and said that she was tricked. She said she never meant to have Ben pardoned. She only meant to forgive him. After this, all of the goodwill towards Ben Bess went away. The grand jury that was convened to investigate Maud turned towards investigating Ben. Maud's son, Parker, wrote a letter to the grand jury saying that his mother had been taken advantage of. The $50 that she was given was only to forgive Ben. Maud wrote a second affidavit. This time, she told a completely different story, one in which she said the respectable white men tricked her for the benefit of a black man. In Maud's second affidavit, she said that she never signed any paper releasing Ben from what he did to her. She said that she could not read or write and that Negroes had come to her for a long time trying to get her to sign a petition to get Ben out, and she refused. She said that everything people claimed about her family was a lie. She said she testified truthfully at the trial, and when she signed the paper, she never meant to pardon Ben. She only meant to forgive him, not for him to be released from prison. On June 21st, 1928, the grand jury declared that Ben Bess was pardoned on a petition that was based on slick fraud. Maud did not know what she was signing. It also said that Maud had been tricked by the white men into signing the affidavit, and Ben had perpetrated a fraud on the state of South Carolina and the entire nation. After the grand jury issued its findings, Ben was rearrested and put in jail. 2 officers came to Ben and told him that Governor Richards sent them to get him. They told Ben that his life was in danger and people wanted to lynch him, and it would be best if he went back to prison for his own safety. The governor's office said that Ben volunteered to go back to the prison, but that wasn't the truth. When Ben got back to the prison, they wouldn't let him leave. He asked to leave, and they said no. He was forced to stay, and also he couldn't speak to his attorney. He could write to his attorney, but the prison wouldn't let him see him or speak to him. Remember at first, the governor ordered the AG to investigate the possibility of bringing charges against Maud Collins for lying on Ben? Well, now he wanted an investigation into this fraud that he claimed happened, which means that He wanted respected white men who were businessmen and lawyers and judges to be put in jail. This shows you the irrational nature of Jim Crow. It didn't matter if something was right or wrong. It didn't matter who was caught up in the whirlwind of racism. All that mattered is that Jim Crow won every time. While Ben was back in prison, Governor Richards ordered Attorney General Daniel to conduct an investigation into this matter. The AG said that he would get to the bottom of this and figure out how this fraud was carried out to get Ben released and prosecute all those who were involved in it. In early July of 1928, Governor Richards went to the prison to talk to Ben. Ben said that he wanted to be released and he wanted to go to New York. The governor said that he convinced Ben to stay and that Ben agreed that it would be best if he stayed in prison for his own safety. The governor made it seem like Ben wanted to be in prison. This gave them cover as they formulated what was about to happen next. They needed to keep Ben in prison for this to work. And the governor was also holding in his back pocket a warrant that he had issued for Ben for a made-up charge that Ben had attacked a prisoner years earlier. If Ben left prison, he would have been arrested again, and he told Ben this. So it wasn't that Ben agreed to stay, but rather that they were holding a warrant over Ben's head should he try to leave. On July 17, 1928, Governor Richards revoked Ben's pardon. He said that Ben had committed fraud and the pardon was therefore withdrawn and was null and void. This was the first time in the history of South Carolina that a pardon had been revoked. After his pardon was revoked, Ben was sent back to the prison farms to begin working as a convict laborer once again. He thought that his nightmare was over, but he was back doing the grueling work that he had done for 13 years. But this was not the end of the fight. Black attorney Nathaniel J. Frederick stepped in to help Ben and Sally. Attorney Frederick was one of the most remarkable and overlooked civil rights champions of the Jim Crow era. There is so much to say about his incredible legacy that I could easily spend this entire video talking just about him. He was a trailblazing legal force long before the emergence of Thurgood Marshall and other giants of the modern civil rights movement. Frederick brought more than 30 cases before the South Carolina Supreme Court for his black clients. He was also the head of the Howard School, South Carolina's only public school for black children, and he was the founder and the editor of the Palmetto Leader, a black newspaper in South Carolina. Attorney Frederick, along with another attorney, A.L. King, prepared a writ of habeas corpus petition. This is a legal proceeding where a person petitions a court because they are being illegally detained. It requires a state or a jailer to come to court and provide the lawful reason why they are holding someone. If the court finds the detention unjustified, it can order the person's release. Ben's attorney said that he was pardoned and could no longer be held for that conviction. They argued that the state of South Carolina was violating Ben's rights and the Constitution by holding him. The writ was filed on July 14, 1928, with Judge W.H. Townsend. Judge W.H. Townsend referred the habeas petition to Master on Equity of Richland County, J.C. Townsend, who was to review the matter and then make a recommendation on how to proceed. On August 2, 1928, Master J.C. Townsend conducted a full hearing. Very few white people attended, but a lot of black people who supported Ben came to the hearing, and Ben was also present. Witnesses were called. John Timmons and Judge Lawrence both testified about what happened, and they said that Maude knew very full well what she was signing, and she never said a word about being confused or it being wrong. Attorney Gordon Baker testified, and he said that he did draft the affidavit and sent it to the governor's office. He said that he had no interest in the matter and he was not even paid for this. He said Ben offered to pay him once he was released, but he refused payment. Governor Richards also testified. He said that Prosecutor Gaskew brought Ben's case to his attention and that it was Maude's affidavit that convinced him to pardon Ben. The governor also said that he had Ben sent back to prison after he was convinced that the pardon was obtained by fraud. The governor said that Ben did agree to go back to prison when he was asked by the officers, but that they had strict instructions that if Ben refused, he was to be forcibly arrested and taken back to the prison. Maude Collins testified. When Maude was called to the witness stand, she walked in a slow and feeble manner. She wanted to give the impression that she was an old lady who was taken advantage of. She was around 50 years old at the time, and she kept her mouth covered with a handkerchief. When asked if she knew Ben Bess, she began to cry and the hearing had to stop so that she could calm herself. Maude told Master Townsend that she knew Ben, but she only forgave him. She never wanted him pardoned. She then said that Ben's wife, who she called his old lady, kept bothering her. She said Ben committed the crime and he was guilty. She then blamed the two white men, John Timmons and Judge Lawrence, and said that the judge read the paper to her very slowly and she could barely hear it or understand what it was. When asked about the money she was paid, she said it was to get her teeth pulled. But Maude was making all of this up, and there was evidence to prove it. Ben's attorney asked Maude if she was told by a detective sent by the governor that if she did not sign a second statement recanting her first affidavit, that she would be prosecuted. Maude didn't answer at first. As everyone waited for her to answer, Ben leaned forward in his chair, waiting for her to tell the truth. Then Maude said that she was told this. She admitted under oath that she only changed her story after she was informed that she was about to be prosecuted. After reviewing all of the evidence and hearing the testimony, Master J.C. Townsend found that there was no fraud in obtaining Ben's pardon. He said that Maude understood what she was signing and she only changed her tune after she learned that she might be prosecuted and sent to jail. That was the only reason she was claiming that she was tricked. Master Townsend wrote a report for Judge W.H. Townsend recommending that Ben's pardon be upheld and be released from prison. After Master J.C. Townsend found that there was no fraud, the case was sent back to Judge W.H. Townsend. He still had the final say as to what would happen with Ben's habeas petition. He would decide if Ben would be released or remain in prison. The state objected to the master's report and wanted Judge W.H. Townsend not to follow the recommendation. On August 23, 1928, Judge W.H. Townsend held a hearing to determine if he'd follow Master Townsend's recommendation. Once again, attorneys Frederick and King represented Ben. Attorney Frederick argued that the $50 was not a bribe, but rather Maude asked for that amount and Ben gave it to her for her to tell the truth. He said that the fact that money was paid did not mean that Maude was not telling the truth in the affidavit she signed. Frederick also argued that the only reason Maude was now saying that she was tricked was because she knew she was about to be prosecuted for perjury. The possibility of her going to jail made her change her story. She was not tricked. She was just being dishonest again. He also impressed upon the judge that a pardon was final and could not be revoked. Attorney General John Daniel represented the state, and he argued that Ben should remain in prison and serve out the remainder of his prison sentence and that the pardon had been obtained by fraud. Judge W.H. Townsend did not agree with Master J.C. Townsend. On August 22, 1928, Judge W.H. Townsend found that there was fraud and that the governor had the authority to revoke Ben's pardon. He said that the money paid to Maude Collins amounted to a bribe and that the evidence given to the governor for Ben's pardon was fraudulent. He said that Maude was an illiterate woman who did not understand what was going on and that she was induced to sign the affidavit. Ben was ordered to go back to prison to finish his 30-year prison sentence, but attorneys Frederick and King continued to fight for Ben. 1 week after Judge Townsend denied the request to free Ben, they appealed his case to the South Carolina Supreme Court. On November 12, 1928, the Supreme Court heard arguments on Ben's case, but Ben sat in prison for another year waiting for the court to rule. He continued to work grueling days doing forced labor in prison for something that he did not do. On October 12, 1929, the Supreme Court issued its ruling. It said that Ben Bess was being illegally held and must be freed. The court said that a pardon is a pardon and it cannot be revoked. 3 days later, on October 15, 1929, Ben was finally released from prison. His 14-year nightmare was finally over. Ben went to prison wealthy and he came out destitute. When he was released, Ben moved to Pennsylvania. He wanted to leave South Carolina as quickly as possible. It was no longer safe for him there. It's not clear what happened to him and Sally and whether they stayed together. Census records show that in 1940, Ben was still living in Pennsylvania and he was struggling. And Sally was not living with him. Ben was 64 years old, living in Allegheny County, and he was working as a laborer in a stone quarry. He didn't own a home like he had before, and he was renting a room from a young black couple named James and Evelyn Darby. Sally died in July of 1951 at the age of 50. Her death certificate says that she was widowed at the time of her death, which means that Ben had already died. It also says that she died in South Carolina, which means that her and Ben likely never got back together. We don't know how the 14 years of incarceration affected Ben and Sally's marriage. We can only imagine the strain that it put on them. After 14 years of being in a Jim Crow nightmare, you can't go back to normal. A lie from Frank and Maude Collins destroyed Ben's life. A lie took everything from him. Maud died in 1943 at the age of 73. She never paid for her crimes, but Ben paid for his. Ben's real and only crime was being black. Ben's story had remained the same since 1914, and that was that he was innocent. He never wavered in this. As for Maud, she changed her story every time it was convenient for her, and each time she was believed. Ben was never believed. His guilt or innocence always hinged on what Maud said at the moment. In 1915, Maud said that Ben was guilty, so he went to prison. In 1928, she said that he was innocent and he was freed, only for her to change her mind and say that he was guilty, and Ben was sent back to prison. In the Jim Crow era, being black meant that you lacked credibility. It didn't matter what the truth was. A lie against a black person would always win. I want to know your thoughts on this story. Had you ever heard of Ben Bess, and how did it make you feel learning all that he went through? Leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts.